I'd like to introduce you. I'd like to set up today. Basically, this presentation is, or this discussion is called "A Thriving Minority: What Students with Special Needs Can Teach Us About Successful Remote Learning." And I'd like to introduce our two panelists. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine Welby, who's the author of a newly released book. So I'd encourage you to go to Amazon or a local bookstore and buy it. It's called "Remote Learning Strategies for Students with IEPs, an Educator's Guidebook." So if in any way, shape, or form, you're going to be seeing some form of online or hybrid learning going forward, this is a book that you should definitely be purchasing. So Catherine has written articles and commentaries for Phi Delta Kappa, the IAFOR Journal of Education, Attitude Magazine, Creighton Journal of Interdisciplinary Leadership, and the Council for Children with Behavioral Disorders. Catherine is currently the Director of Teacher Preparation Programs and a Professor of Practice at Merrimack College in North Andover, Massachusetts. And we're joined by Wendy Thompson, who has been a special ed classroom teacher for 30 years. She's been working for the A. Harry Moore Laboratory School in New Jersey City University and has worked with experienced and new educators as well as therapeutic specialists in the provision of services for individuals with disabilities. Wendy has a PhD in education, is the current president of the New Jersey Coalition for the Advancement of Assistive and Rehabilitation Technology. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here. It is greatly appreciated. So just as I was signing on here, you were making a comment that you're excited by technology and its potential for students with special needs. I'd love to hear from both of you, actually. What is it that excites you about technology, particularly with kids with special needs? Catherine, do you want us to start off?
Yeah, I can start off. That's a great question, Robert, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here today. I would think what's exciting for me is that by having technology available, you're having options and accommodations for all the different learners. It's not what works for one student may not work for another student. And we have found in this process of by having remote learning strategies, we're having remote options, is that students that typically did not do well, sometimes social stressors of the classroom, did well learning remotely. So I think it's a nice option to have for all learners.
Interesting. And Wendy, what's your take on it?
For me, I think it's really important, the inclusion of technology in a classroom setting for all students, but especially students with disabilities, because I strongly believe that technology acts as a gateway to the real world for especially students with significant disabilities or cognitive disabilities who find it difficult to access information through a normal book, paper, pen kind of access method. Using technology is like a leveling of the field for them. It helps them with access methods. It helps with understanding and comprehension. And it does it in a way that is not stigmatizing. So for me, tech is it. I'm big on tech.
Now, but let me, if I may, push back slightly on that. I guess because your experiences are across children of all types. I remember, it's interesting as a parent because there's a lot of social pressure, obviously, increasingly, about your kids keeping up, and certain types of parents are obsessed with getting their kids into the right schools and all that pressure that goes along with it. And so amongst parents, there's a lot of discussion if your child is struggling, falling behind, what you do about it, because you don't realize that there's many ways in life to be successful. So, school isn't for everybody and you can step out. But it's interesting, when I was listening to one parent talk about their experience, they said that it's been a godsend learning online because of the reduced anxiety that their child goes through. that in the morning, not just on the child, but on the entire family, the stress of getting their kid ready to go to school is massive. But conversely, I've got a child, the school, my daughter is in grade 4, and she is expected to be basically 300 minutes online. She just does not have the capacity to follow at that level. So it really is a mixed bag. I mean, it must be immensely challenging already to be an educator that deals with special needs, to try and manage those levels through technology. It's hard enough in the classroom. How do you manage that engagement? Like, how do you, as an educator through this interface, manage students of different levels?
Want me to start, Wendy?
Sure.
I was thinking by incorporating both asynchronous activities and synchronous activities, so they don't have to be in front of a screen at all times. If you're talking about the remote learning experience, many kids cannot be in front of the computer for 8 hours at a time. But even if you do a backwards design where you have students do certain A, B, C activities and then get on and they discuss it as a group, and then they can go back and do A, B, C activities and discuss it as a group, but have some type of asynchronous along with synchronous, and times for breaks. I think having breaks, brain breaks, whether they are scheduled in the day or whether they are part of the agenda, is helpful for many students. Have a time where they can get off being online and do a Go Noodle or do some type of dancing or go outside, make a sensory path with chalk outside on your driveway, something like that. But have breaks during the day, because most students cannot sit in front of a computer for 8 hours at a time.
Mm.
I totally agree with Catherine in that having spent the last year and months doing exactly that, having to build my schedule around the needs of my students. And, you have to be able to adapt to the needs of the student. If you have a student who cannot sit for that long to visually focus on a screen, then as a teacher, you have to adapt what you're offering to that student, offering them activities that may be accessed in a different way, providing them breaks. We did brain breaks to start the morning. After every hour, we had a brain break. We had a movement activity. There were things throughout the day to break up the routine. Even in a regular school during the day, you build in breaks to give students a time away from just sitting and learning. So I think when you look at doing your remote learning or your virtual environment in the same way you structure your classroom to provide the break students need, it's one way of giving them that option of movement and more focused activity that is away from the camera. Because even I can't sit for 8 hours straight and stare at a screen. It's not working.
I will say, by the way, just as a quick sidebar, seemingly my kids can watch about 12 hours a day of Disney Plus. So I don't know what their problem is with school, but anyway, get back to it. I'm curious about this. Was the last 15 months a surprise in terms of what you observed from children with special needs? Or had you already been experiencing how kids with special needs were able to operate through online learning?
For me, in some ways, the successes we had were surprising, because initially I was really fearful that my students would not be able to last that much time in a virtual setting, or we were already using programs throughout the day that they were accessing on the computer or laptop or an iPad. So they were used to using the technology within class, but they were also used to being within that group. I was very afraid of the lack of socialization. That was my biggest fear, that they would lose that sense of group from working at home. But that didn't happen for us. I think our group became tighter. Because they didn't have the outside access, they got to see their friends every day. Their class was still there. They got to work more in breakout rooms with staff. So they got more individualized even than what we were able to give in the classroom. They got to have those opportunities to showcase in front of their parents. I think that family aspect, something where a parent's not in school with you every day, but when you're working at home and your parents in the background, I got to do my best because mom or dad is right there over my shoulder and they're seeing this. I can get help from them. That aspect for me of bringing the family into the classroom was so exciting and so motivating. It motivated me as a professional and my kids as learners. So I think that was a major part of our success during this process.
Actually, Catherine, I'm keen to hear your thoughts in a moment. I just want to pick up on that with Wendy. Is that because as a parent of a child with special needs, that you naturally are more actively involved in and more hands-on with education? Because I've heard a lot of the opposite from parents of just children without special needs, that it's been a massive challenge because they've got to be there. They've constantly over the shoulder. They almost feel like they're teaching assistants. So is it that parents of kids like this naturally are more hands-on? Like, what's that about?
I think in some ways it is. I think parents of students with disabilities are prepared to do more in that they know the student may need the assistant. Whereas a student in a regular ed setting my child goes to school, that is now the school's responsibility. A parent of a student with special needs never gives up that sense of responsibility. Whether they're home or in school, that's my child, and I'm always going to be focused on what's happening in either place. But now in the home, I have the opportunity to see how the school does it. It's not just a learning chance for my kid, it's also a learning opportunity for me. It's a chance for me to pick up on how the school does these things that they are having success with my student that maybe I've been struggling with at home. Let me look at the options that the teacher's giving to my child or the way they're introducing topics. And these are things that I can now do more at home. And maybe it gives me that opportunity to really talk to the teacher about how to work with my child on new skills. So for us, it was really a success in that it got the parents more involved on the learning end and not just the care.
Interesting. And Catherine, what has your experience been? Was it a surprise to you what's happened over the last 15 months with kids with special needs?
Yes. So I'm going to put on my teacher preparation hat right now. As the director of teacher preparation for a college, we don't prepare our future teachers for remote learning, and especially children with disabilities, how to teach children remotely with disabilities. So this was a complete surprise, and in a profession of never-ending ongoing professional development, teachers were not given any opportunity to learn about this prior to the pandemic and the shutdowns. So I think it was a huge surprise, and it was one of those experiences that we all had to come together and adjust right away. So this was a surprise, and I was surprised at how well teachers came together, and tons of successes emerged within the struggle of the remote learning. We learned so much that I think it could have taken us 10, 20 years of research to figure out, and we figured it out in a year of what works, what doesn't work, what successes. It was a year of trial and error, and it was a huge surprise. And I think that we actually as educators, I think our future has changed because of this. And although it was a surprise, if we were to plan this, it would take us 20 years to get where we are right now. So I think that it was a great surprise, but it was a surprise that we weren't prepared for.
Wow. So what was, if you think about the last 15 months, if I said extract the key learning, because obviously, I mean, again, forgive me, you know, I'm not teaching at the level that you guys are teaching at, but I'm just really curious that when I came across the research that children with special needs were actually in many cases thriving with this online learning, it was such a counterpoint to what you were reading just across the board about how the year has been a waste, kids will never catch up again. Yeah. So if you could just distill, both of you distill down your experiences, what were the biggest positive things that you noticed in terms of online and what it was doing for kids?
Do you want me to start or do you want to start?
It doesn't matter. You can start, Catherine.
Right, Catherine.
I'm thinking of like examples. For example, I did a lot of research. I had about 250 participants in 37 states and 4 countries tell me what worked for them. What worked for children with disabilities learning online. And I got so many success stories. And one particular example was that multiple collaboratives, high school collaboratives, they had an increased attendance rates. So the students that were slated to fail and not graduate were actually graduating because they were actually logging on to attend school. So the graduation rates were increasing in different educational collaboratives across the country. Students with physical disabilities, social emotional needs were attending more frequently and doing better. In fact, I was telling Wendy before we logged on, Massachusetts alone is going to have 13 to 16 school districts are going to have a virtual option for schooling because of the successes of some students. So I think after this pilot year, I think those numbers are going to jump across the country. You know, sometimes Massachusetts starts with a plan and then it kind of goes up. But I think it's because of the successes of so many students. The graduation rates were increasing, anxiety was low. And although you need those social pieces, I think we're figuring out ways to incorporate the social piece within the remote environment. So I think that was the biggest piece that was lacking. But you're right, media reports all over the news, it was saying how it was failing, how this has failed our students. But I don't think it has failed our students. I think our students actually have thrived because of this experience, many of them. Not everyone, but many of them have thrived.
Wow, and just pick up on that point, because you were saying that there were still some socialization issues that needed to be improved upon, but Wendy, earlier you were talking about that socialization actually was maintained. So I'm curious, what were the kind of the key things that you noticed that were the big advantages the last year?
For me, one of the big advantages is, like Catherine mentioned, attendance, because a lot of my students have medical issues and it's difficult sometimes for them to actually physically get into the building. But when we were virtual, there was not a reason that I could not attend. I can do what I need to do in the safety of my home and in the most comfortable position. So to answer your question, the thing that really, really stuck out for me with my students is that it gave them a voice where they didn't have that sense of, I'm going to mess up in front of someone, that anxiety piece. They didn't feel as if they were under so much stress to perform when they were doing it at home and they were comfortable and they had support from a parent. They tried to do things that they wouldn't do in class. I think in school, sometimes they're so expecting the assistant or the teacher to be there to support them through an activity. Here at home, it kind of gave them independence. They became more self-reliant. They learned to sign in and out of the Zoom room daily, or they learned to log into, we use Seesaw for schools. the application to do our virtual learning that is not face-to-face time. So they learned to sign themselves in and out of their application, complete their activities on Seesaw without the teacher standing over their shoulder going, did you get it done? Do you need help? It was us, and then they felt accomplished by it. And I think that sense of accomplishment for my students was something that I'm hoping carries over when we come back to school full time, in that it then gives them this sense that I can do this with less help. Because a lot of students with disabilities, they become so reliant on others. And the big push is self-reliance. And virtual learning, in a lot of ways, helped push that along.
Just Catherine and Wendy, we've had participants from all over the world. We've had them from Jamaica, Colombia, Tunisia, Germany, Canada, US. I mean, it's quite amazing. What I love about this environment, one of the things I love about Big Blue Button is that it's an open source project that has been shaped by educators around the world. And I love that when it's just sitting here as almost, although I'm participating in this panel discussion, I'm also observing. It's quite interesting to also understand how teachers in very, very different places are all struggling with some of the same issues. It's really quite fascinating. So this, I just want to go to a comment that Craig Henry made in the chat. He said that not every student's the same, but it gives hope knowing that such a group of strong kids who already face pre-existing challenges are able to thrive in a setting where many people thought they'd fail. The reason that we actually chose this panel was for the reason I raised earlier, was like every day you read article after article about how terrible it is, and then you come across articles featuring people like yourselves, and it's like, no, it's positive. So what we're trying to do with this session, obviously, is understand, like, what could we take away from your experiences and apply to kids that don't have some of these pre-existing conditions, and I'm probably going to come back to that, because I'm really curious. Like, one of the earlier individuals said, the keynote actually was saying that we're just going to have to get past it. Like, technology's here; it's not going away. And also commented that you can't take an analog classroom and put it in the digital environment. You've got to adapt and change. And I'm really curious about that. Did you find how much did you have to change or how you were teaching kids to get them to perform in the way that you're performing? Or was it simply enough that they had the distance of technology and that's what enabled them to do this? So what was it? Was it a combination of you changing your approach or simply putting them in a different setting?
I think it was a combination of both. I think because my students were already familiar with the use of technology from what we do in school, they were open to using it in the home. But it also required that I think about how I present things to my class. I had to think about how I introduced new topics, how I expected them to respond, what was acceptable as a way of showing comprehension or understanding or learning. That maybe an answer to a question could be done not just by writing a response, but what can you show me visually? What can you offer me verbally as a way of me understanding or being able to assess whether or not you understand what our topic it has covered? And getting students to feel free with their expression, getting students to know that it's not just wrote paper pencil as a way of responding. Those are the way classes used to be run when Miss Thompson was a student. Way back when I was your age, I sat and wrote out everything. But now there's so many other ways. There's a green screen. Get a piece of green paper, put it behind you and show me something. Visually record yourself with your device. Pick up something in the house and tell me about it. I'm looking for shapes. I'm looking for topics. There are things in your environment that you can use to express yourself with. And that's what I expect you to do. And that is what happened. Kids were finding things around the house, bringing it back to camera. Every day it was like a show and tell, but a show and tell that was structured around learning, not just this is my puppy. Say hi to my puppy. It was, this is an animal. You asked me about living and non-living. This is, my puppy's alive. My water bottle is not, Miss Thompson. It's not real. And it's bad for the environment, they told me. But it's those kinds of things, showing practical uses of your environment to demonstrate your learning. And that's something that tech offers us in this situation that was just amazing for us.
Catherine, what's your take?
So I actually didn't teach. I did the research on the different teachers, but this made me think, and I agree with Wendy, and this made me think of a quote of one of my participants. He was an inclusion teacher, so he had general education and special education combined in his class. And he said to me, and I actually wrote it, I'm going to read it right off of it. It said, "We are experiencing history, an exciting change in education. As educators, we expand our practice to grow because the standards and expectations are so high. We are implementing various instructional styles to accommodate all learners and abilities while using technological resources, pulling students in different formats, communicating in different ways, co-teaching with service providers, and integrating more engaging material. The year of the pivot, 2020, proved that the school's brick and mortar concept is archaic." And I really liked this quote because this made me think that although this is technology and because we're stuck in remote learning, but we're going to be bringing this technology into the classroom. All of these things that have worked, and he talked about green screens and everything that Wendy was talking about. And he just made it seem like, okay, all of this is happening. And how can we go back to how it used to be without having all those technological resources in our classroom, whether it's on ground, whether it's remote, we're never going back. Education is changing.
Do you know what? And do you know, I had this light bulb go off in my head that we returned to Canada. We were living in the UK in London. And about 4 weeks after the lockdown, the kids started having to go into online learning. I asked one of the teachers how it was going. This teacher said, I know nothing about technology. Said, I don't sit at home in front of a computer like somebody that works in an office. I teach in a classroom. So he said, I've got to, it's already complicated enough trying to teach kids of different levels in a classroom to then translate that into online. But what you're saying, Catherine, and by the way, what you're saying is it's absolutely unavoidable. Change must occur. But, what do you say to an educator that's going, what are you talking about? I've been teaching for 20 years. I haven't been in front of a bloody computer. How am I supposed to adapt this now with kids at all these different levels? And by the way, Catherine and Wendy, you're both in the United States, and the surprising thing in speaking to American educators is how diverse the system is there. You've literally got kids that are homeless and kids coming from affluent families. All over the map. It's incredible. So, what would you say to an educator to prepare? And let me just put this in one additional point of context. I'm wondering whether, people like you, Wendy, have an advantage over traditional teachers. Because you specialize in teaching kids with special needs, you probably have to have a wider toolkit than a teacher who's in a regular classroom. Would you say that's true?
I think in some ways it is true because I think a special educator is it's innate for us to specialize, to individualize our instruction for each student. Our mind automatically thinks not as the group as a whole, but how can I reach this student on his or her level to bring them to where they need to be? What does this student need? And what tool can I use to help them get there? And whereas in a regular ed setting, the mindset is teach to the middle and reach for the high and bring up the low. And I think for special educators, that's just not the way we're developed. We're developed in that you reach for the individual and you want to get that individual where they need to be, whatever way that works for them. So having that, there's always a new search for a tool that works. There's always a willingness to try something new. You want to find your go-tos, and everyone has their toolbox with their go-tos that they stay with and they use consistently, but you're more open to something new coming in and being there to help you get to that next level or help your student get to the next level. I've worked with regular ed teachers and special ed teachers and therapists, and I think a lot of the times it's, especially during this pandemic, it was giving people options. For those teachers that were resistant because they weren't used to using technology on the same level. So many of them over the course of this year have seen a drastic change. And even from being on Facebook groups and Twitter feeds, you hear teachers who've been in the game a long time, like I have, talk about the new outlook on what we're doing because of this year, how they've learned so many things, how they've learned so many new tools, and how it's refreshed their concept of what teaching's all about. So I think those are the positives that people aren't talking about, that refresh of your thought process as an educator.
That's interesting. So that is, really interesting. So I'm curious then, again, what would your advice be for teachers, given the fact that you have had positive experiences when you've researched, Catherine, you've heard it from teachers. What would your advice be to a teacher in a more traditional classroom setting to kind of embrace this change, and what should they take from your experiences to be better educators in this new reality?
I think the reality is as educators, we want a solution today. We don't want to wait. We want to know what to do right now. But to be honest with you, the best teaching comes from trial and error. So I feel like all these teachers who are resistant, just give it a try. Trial, error. And a lot actually has to come down from the administrator in training, in the proper training for these teachers too. And teaching is about continuous professional development. So I think this needs to be incorporated more into the professional development so they feel comfortable doing these things. And also, starting at the teacher preparation program, we need to start incorporating technology into our programs, because prior to this year, we weren't teaching students about technology, the resources for technology. But this needs to be more involved in our training. So it's going to be a ripple effect. New teachers are going to be more comfortable, can train the teachers, the experienced teachers, and the administrator needs to come on board, because there has to be professional development anyways. This could be incorporated into professional development. But again, trial and error. It has to realize that you may not be comfortable tomorrow, but the more you do it, the more comfortable it's going to be. And I think that's what the profession is all about. Trial and error and relationship development. And remote learning and all these strategies, the foundation is trial and error and relationship building, learning your students needs.
That's interesting. I've always seen the potential, and it's interesting. Fred Dixon, who's one of the founders of Big Blue Button, was saying that what drove him was this idea that one day he would go to a remote village somewhere, and he would find the kids learning there because of Big Blue Button. That has been the promise of technology in education, hasn't it? To take it to the farthest corners, to make access to elite level education more democratic and more accessible to people. So it's, in a way, and just a comment, not a question, it's incredible that we've been forced in the last 15 months to adapt in a way that we weren't prepared for. And so many people have been left with a negative impression of what's possible through this. And I think that to your point, if we can embrace the change for all of its full potential, then we can make amazing progress. So we have a question from somebody that's listening or watching. Basically, the person asks, I assume that you do exams for students with special needs. How did you manage it through remote learning?
For the state of New Jersey this year, they actually held off on testing for the regular ed population, but for students with disabilities, they required testing. We actually use the DLM dynamic learning maps testing system that's actually a requirement in the state of New Jersey. And it's computer-based. So we had students actually come into the building to do it because we could not proctor the test from home. So that's the way it was handled in the state of New Jersey. I can't really say how it's done anywhere else throughout the United States, but in the state of New Jersey, they actually had any student whose parents agreed have the student come into the building for testing.
So my final question is, and I think it's, again, supporting something that Craig Henry said here in the chat. My final question is this. Like earlier, Catherine, you mentioned this idea of you got to get different tools in the classroom. You've got to have, the greens for greens, et cetera. And Craig makes the comment that we need to take these more leaps of faith in trying these new things. So my final question to you is basically, obviously, technology as it stands now is far from perfect. So going from here, what do you think needs to be done on behalf of education technology creators? What do you think the people who make this technology need to know in creating the right technology for students? And what do educators need to know to utilize it more effectively?
I can take that one. I think that is a tough question because I sometimes wonder if technology lacks different features, or we as educators are not trained properly or thoroughly on the products. So I think it would be wonderful if creators could incorporate more accessibility features directly in the platform rather than having to use additional apps such as text-to-speech, the Google extensions, Grammarly. If those could be part of the platform, it would be great. And it would alleviate a lot of prep time for the teachers and create more of an all-inclusive remote environment. And again, a lot of teachers are finding all of these things from the outside and bringing them into the platform. And again, I wonder if it's because teachers aren't educated on the platforms or if they're just not available right now. So teachers would need in-depth training of the technologies that are offered, because sometimes teachers are told the night before, oh, tomorrow you're going to use this, tomorrow you're going to use that. And that's up to the teachers to learn it themselves. So if there could be more of a training process, because like I said, a lot of these platforms could have these features that we just don't know about. So more accessibility within the platform for diverse learners is what I would think.
And for me, this is one of my really strong things. I strongly believe in contacting a company. I've been working with a couple of different companies who are startups on what are types of features for students with disabilities that should be a part of the ground up build of your platform. And I agree, getting in the accessibility features from the beginning so that they are just a part of the program. There's no extra add-ons. It makes it easier for the user. It makes it easier for the teacher who's planning, so that you're not going to have to add on an extra extension or another device because it's already built in. And what I've found is companies are so open to having these discussions with educators. They're begging educators to tell them, what are the things you're looking for? What are the things you need in your technology programs for students? If you tell us, then we know what to build. But because they're not in the classroom for most of the time, or they've been out of the classroom for a while and they don't see the day-to-day issues that teachers do. But they're so open to working with teachers on making those changes, and they will update it and add it. And then it makes you really happy when you don't have to add that extension or do something different because it's already there. But talk to the producers.
Do you know, Wendy, I was going to say that the interesting thing about BigBlueButton is that it is an open source product, and it has been shaped by teachers all over the world. And I think, it is, you're right. There's the people who develop the products aren't in the classroom. They don't understand the magic and the nuance of what it takes to be an effective teacher. Unfortunately, we have to wrap this session up. I just want to, on a small personal note, as I mentioned, I've got a daughter who has developmental issues, and I've witnessed teachers on 2 different continents now, 2 different cities, in the way that they work with her. And I'm amazed. We've never had a bad teacher. And the dedication of teachers to work with her, even if they weren't specialists in special needs, has been remarkable. And I so admire. I can tell you that I'm exhausted having 3 of my own kids. I can't imagine what it's like having 30 of them in a classroom, and the dedication I've witnessed is remarkable. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you to you guys and to all of you who are educators. And thank you as well, Wendy and Catherine, for this panel discussion. It's been really fascinating.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lovely way to spend the afternoon.
It really has. Thank you. This was fun.
Great, guys. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you.